Hey, and welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Farhan, and along with Kit, we seek to take our listeners on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible unto the growth of Christ's body. This is episode 51 in our journey through the scripture series. We encourage you to start at the beginning. And obviously, if you're just joining us, even going back a couple episodes will give you quite a bit of context for where we are in salvation history. Over the last couple of episodes, we've really unpacked the importance of the recovery of the Judean exiles and how not only that episode is significant, but how it actually lays the groundwork for much of what will be fulfilled shortly with Christ as he arrives on the scene too. And so one of the things we really want to unpack today too is really talk about how this recovery of the Judean exiles really leads to this idea of a promise of a restored kingdom and how that is fulfilled at multiple levels, right? We've obviously talked about some of the physical elements and how ultimately these speak to a deeper relational reality. And so, Kit, to that point, I want to kind of jump in with our first question here. How does the return of the Judean exiles highlight the difference between the physical restoration, which we obviously unpacked quite a bit over the last couple of episodes, to the land, and the deeper relational exile that still remain unresolved between Yahweh and his people?
Well, again, we saw last time that the prophets had promised two things. They had promised that both houses of Israel, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, both houses would end up being conquered and be dragged into exile. Exile was coming to the totality of the Israelite people. But they also, on the other hand, promised that that was not to be the last word, that exile would be resolved by the Lord. And Jeremiah in particular associated that restoration with a period of 70 years. Daniel spoke to that, and you see that elsewhere in the Old Testament. But you have basically a period of around 70 years where God let the land rest, enjoy its Sabbaths that had been denied to it. And then we talked about how this Persian king Cyrus, who had conquered the Babylonians, issued a decree allowing the Judeans to return to the land of Israel. And that was basically fulfilling that 70-year cycle. The temple was rebuilt, and that rebuilding was completed in 516 BC. So the temple was basically destroyed for a period of 70 years. But once again, that physical restoration to the land didn't really solve the greater problem. We talked about how it was Israel's covenant unfaithfulness that had brought this calamity about in the first place. It had caused Yahweh to depart from them, to allow the city and the sanctuary to be destroyed, and the people to be slaughtered and drug away into captivity and exile as well. And so even though you had a physical restoration back to the land of Judea, and even though the temple was rebuilt, as we talked last time, the most obvious, perhaps, evidence that this hadn't really solved the problem was that God's own glory, his presence, hadn't returned to the sanctuary. So the temple remained empty. And this became then the basis for Israel's hope that, yes, those 70 years had passed. Yes, they were back in the land. Yes, they had rebuilt the temple. And within another 70 or 80 years, they would rebuild the city walls as well. But the great hope that the prophets had put in front of them is that Yahweh was going to return. And when he did, he was going to deal with the problem of relational estrangement. And once again, as we've emphasized over and over again, biblically, exile is a relational concept. And so Israel's exile was not a matter of where they were located geographically. This Abrahamic covenant household would not really be recovered from exile, liberated, until it was regathered to God and that relationship was restored.
Kit, speak a little bit more to this idea of regathering and reconstitution. We've talked a lot about that. Maybe you could even unpack that a little bit more. Along with exile, why is it so important for us to understand too just these concepts of regathering and reconstitution? And obviously, we've already hinted that even Christ himself will become Israel indeed. But at the same time, too, is it will morph and turn into something that I think a lot of people miss because it doesn't come in the package. It doesn't come in the form that they're accustomed to or they desire. Just speak a little bit about just the importance of rightly understanding those concepts in terms as well.
Well, I think maybe the easiest way to see, excuse me, the challenge of that was the case of the sons of Israel. When Jesus came into the world, when Jesus was born and began proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, there was confusion. And the people of Israel, even those who were scholarly, those who were devout, those who knew the scriptures, struggled to see how in any way the person of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus could be connected with this messianic hope that the people had developed in the centuries of that Second Temple period. And so the prophets spoke clearly of what God was going to do. But as I think we ended on this note maybe the last time, prophecy is not like a videotape of the future. And so the way that the prophets wove these themes and ideas together, the actual meaning, the actual reality of those concepts and those images couldn't really be known until it had been realized in time and space and in history. So there was the need for Israel, the Jewish people of Christ's generation, to rethink their expectation of the kingdom. And they understood all of the ideas. They understood, again, that the prophets had said that Yahweh was going to return. He was going to return to his sanctuary. And in connection with this son of David, he was going to liberate the people from that which really bound them, the captivity, the subjugating power that held them. And there was going to be cleansing. There was going to be forgiveness of sin. We talked about that being a covenant idea. God was going to deal with the covenant violation that had brought the estrangement between him and the Abrahamic people. And in that way, then he was going to regather them to himself, not just in terms of location, but in terms of relationship. So ultimately, he would again take his place in his sanctuary. This son of David, through whom this liberation and ingathering would be accomplished, would take his place on the throne of Yahweh again, as had been the case with David before him. And God would cleanse and renew and forgive and establish in a perfect, everlasting way this relationship with the people of Israel. But that was the way the prophets had spoken. But in centuries from the Babylonian exile to the coming of Christ, the thinking of the people of Israel became more and more national and physical, and they began to expect more and more that the Messiah was going to come and raise an army. And some of the messianic figures that had preceded Jesus, that the Jews thought perhaps this person is the Messiah, that's just what they had done. They were military men who raised an army and tried to ride against whatever Gentile power was kind of exercising sway in Judea at that time. And so by the time Jesus is born, the expectation was a liberator who would deliver them from Rome. And ultimately that this kingdom, this restoration, this return of Yahweh to Zion and the restoring of David's house and throne and kingdom, that would very much look like the previous theocratic kingdom, the previous Davidic kingdom. And what they were confronted with through Jesus and through his work, and most powerfully through his death at the hands of Rome, was that all of these things that God had promised he was going to do. But as you said, it wasn't going to look the way they thought. This wasn't about liberation from Roman power. This wasn't about the land of Canaan. This wasn't about, the Messiah sitting on a physical throne in Jerusalem in that sort of a way. What this was going to be was ultimately, again, about restoring the relationship between God and the Abrahamic people. And that meant that the real enemy had to be vanquished, which was the enemy of alienation, estrangement, death, the curse.
Mhm.
And these are the
Right.
things that they had to rethink. And you see this particularly through Paul's own experience, Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the Apostle. He was a scholar, he was a Pharisee, he was one of the leading minds in Israel at that time. And he had to rethink all of these things in the light of the Christ event, what the person and the work and the death, the resurrection, all of Jesus, all of those things had to be kind of reworked in his mind to see how it was that God had done exactly what he'd promised. He had inaugurated this kingdom promised to David and the people of Israel, but not in the way that they expected.
Absolutely. Kid, building on that idea, in what ways did the post-exilic prophets portray Yahweh's future return to Zion through his messianic servant as the means by which redemption, full reconciliation, and the ultimate Davidic kingdom would be established?
Well, I've kind of hinted at that a little bit, but this was maybe the central theme in the promise of that exile wouldn't be the last word, the promise of the prophets that God was going to restore, he was going to heal, he was going to forgive, he was going to regather his people, and he was going to cause Israel to be Israel for the sake of his purposes for the nation. But the central issue, maybe the fundamental, most important issue, is that he himself was going to return. Because unless and until God returned, which meant reconciling himself to his people, once again, it was their covenant unfaithfulness, their harlotry, as the prophets put it, their spiritual harlotry, that had caused him to abandon them, for him to depart, and then for him to also send them away from the land of Canaan, which once again, as we've emphasized, was his sanctuary land. It was his dwelling place. So he was breaking that relationship between him and the Abrahamic people because they had been unfaithful as the covenant son. So he had to return in order for any of this to take place. Yahweh was going to return, but for him to return in that way meant that he was going to deal with that alienation between him and the people. He was going to deal with the problem that had broken the relationship in the first place. So that was the central issue of the hope of the people of Israel in that Second Temple period from the captivity and the exile. And even as we've talked, after the return, they were waiting for this coming of the kingdom, which had its focal point in the return of Yahweh to Zion. And that we talked last time about this promise of a forerunner in Isaiah's prophecy, one who would come, a messenger who would come and would announce Yahweh's return to establish his kingdom. And as you said, all of this was kind of also centered in a particular messianic figure who the prophets said, this is that branch of David, this is that son of David who will come and do this work. So in a kind of mysterious way, Yahweh himself is going to return, and he's going to, do like he did in Egypt and arise and use his power against this subjugating force that has held his people captive. And he's going to bring them out, and he's going to forgive and cleanse and restore them, and once again take his place in their midst. All of that was going to be accomplished somehow in connection with this Davidic branch. Somehow Yahweh was going to return in connection with him. And I think we ended on Isaiah 59 the last time, of Yahweh's promise to return, but that promise to return then is connected with a redeemer coming to Zion.
Yeah, the question that I think some of our listeners and watchers may wonder too is, we've referenced the post-exilic prophets quite a bit over the last couple of episodes. From your perception, and maybe even from scripture, to maybe even giving us some references, do we have a sense that they clearly knew just how significant they were in salvation history, not only in terms of advancing these promises, Kit, but also clarifying and really refining these promises, as you've talked about, really helping their current audience rethink and align their understanding of these things and how they would be fulfilled, to your point, Kate, even from our last episode, even beyond their own understanding. Do we have evidence from scripture that shows they even had an awareness of their significance and place in salvation history as they were sharing it and helping the people make sense of these things?
Well, at some level, I suppose that's a difficult question to answer in a concrete way. Uh, Peter had said that the prophets searched with all diligence and longing, seeking to discern the time, the circumstance, the person to whom the Spirit of the Lord was pointing in these things that were revealed to them.
Right.
And I think that they clearly did not understand beyond their time and their circumstance exactly how these things would work out. Because again, as we keep stressing, prophetic disclosure or revelation is not like a videotape of the future or a newspaper article. But at the same time, they were very aware of their vocation, their mission on behalf of their generation, that people that God sent them to. And they understood that the message that they were bringing pertained to the people of Israel, to their circumstance, to not only their past and their present, but establishing for them a greater grounding of hope and longing for the future. So we generally classify the prophets the biblical prophets, the writing prophets, in terms of pre-exile, exile, and post-exile. So we kind of frame them and their prophetic ministry around that thing, particularly of the exile of the southern kingdom, specifically David's kingdom. But the post-exile prophets, as you mentioned, were the ones who prophesied in Israel after the exiles returned to Judea and were rebuilding the temple and then later the city walls. So, Zechariah and Haggai in particular focused their prophetic ministry on this issue of the temple that's being rebuilt at that time. And they were contemporaries of one another, but that is where their prophecy was focused, was on the need to rebuild the temple and the significance of that, but also communicating that the significance of that new second temple that was being rebuilt went beyond the physical structure and went beyond the present significance of just rebuilding this particular, dwelling place for Yahweh. And even more, they made it clear that this return of Yahweh was going to be something that was not going to happen right away. And when it did happen, it was going to bring about this complete renewal and global ingathering, bringing in of all the families of the earth that ultimately was the purpose for the Israelite people and, as the people of Abraham to begin with. So they spoke to very real needs and circumstances. In that case of those two prophets, the building of the temple. I think last time we mentioned Zechariah, how Zechariah tells the people, yes, build, yes, it's important, keep at this, but ultimately realize that it's not by might, not by power, but it's by the Spirit that Yahweh's sanctuary is going to be built. And then he goes on through a physical prophecy of crowning the high priest. He declares that the branch of David is the one who's going to build the house. Well, I thought you said the Spirit's going to build the sanctuary. Well, the Spirit is going to build the sanctuary, but in connection with this branch of David, who interestingly, and I think we'll talk about this more, is seated as a priest on his throne. And it's in connection with that priestly reign that the house of Yahweh promised to David is actually to be built. So the prophets are dealing with a very real thing. And at the very least, they understood and communicated to the people in terms of those two prophets, yes, build, yes, this temple's important, but also recognize that the significance of what you're doing is greater than you know. And the ultimate significance lies out in the future. in connection with this renewed, restored kingdom that God has promised, first to Abraham, but then also to David and to the sons of Israel as well through the prophets.
Why does the promise of an everlasting kingdom require a renewed covenant people marked by true righteousness, and by righteousness meaning rightness? And how do the prophets connect this renewal to a transformed human heart, a restored sonship too?
Well, this again kind of builds on that same thing. The prophets promised that exile would not be the last word. They also said that when Yahweh arises and does this great delivering, redeeming, restoring work, it's going to bring about a restoration that is going to actually address the fundamental problem of Israel as a people having hearts that are far from the Lord. No matter how much they're committed to his Torah, his covenant, to being faithful to him as his covenant sons and daughters, they just find themselves always unfaithful. They cannot and will not fulfill their calling as son of God. And so the restoration, the recovery from exile that the prophets are promising involves the restoring of the people as well. And you see this, in Jeremiah where God says in chapter 31, days are coming when I'm going to renew the covenant, make a new covenant with the house of Israel and Judah. It will differ from the covenant relationship that I ratified at Sinai. They have not known me. They have been unfaithful sons, though I have been a husband to them. But when I renew this covenant, when I make this new covenant with Israel and Judah, I will put my Torah, my law, my instruction in their hearts, and I will write it on their hearts and their minds. And they will all know me, and they will be faithful. They will become what they should have been all along, what I called them to be. And Ezekiel says the same thing. The day is going to come when God's going to take the heart of stone out of the Abrahamic people and give them a heart of flesh, meaning a living, tender, sincere heart. And he's going to cleanse them, and he's going to renew them and restore them. And you see this in the prophets, that what God is promising is not just something that replicates what happened in Egypt, where a people were brought out of a physical captivity and brought into a physical land. When he does this second Exodus that Isaiah is promising, when he ends their exile, he will do it in truth, because he's returning to them. He will cause them to return to him in truth in their hearts. And so this renewed, everlasting kingdom that has Yahweh at the center of it, enthroned and dwelling in the midst of his people, requires that they also be cleansed and healed and reconciled to him and become one heart and mind with him, so that now at last the promise to Abraham can be fulfilled, that in truth, God says, I will be your God and you will be my people. You will know me. You will follow me. And now as Israel becomes son indeed, it can finally become the light of the nations, the source of God's blessing going to all the families of the earth, which was the whole reason for Israel's calling and vocation to begin with. So a transformed human heart is absolutely vital. That's been the problem all along. It wasn't geographical, exile or enemies conquering them. All of Israel's woes came upon them because their hearts were hard and they were broken and they did not listen to their God.
Indeed, too. And pursuing and securing that authentic humanity, as you talked about, Kit, is not a geographical solution, but as you mentioned too, stems from like the relational estrangement too, and God
Right.
restoring and addressing that at its root too. Kit, building on that idea, how does the prophetic portrayal of the messianic servant bring together Yahweh's return as redeemer and the priestly resolution of Israel's guilt, thereby addressing both dimensions of exile, covenant alienation and human uncleanness?
Well, I think we certainly see this clearly in Isaiah's servant songs. We talked about how that last section of Isaiah from chapter 40 to 66 begins with the word of comfort. Comfort, comfort my people. Speak kindly to Jerusalem. Tell her that her warfare has ended, her conflict. And so the message of comfort is that Yahweh is going to return to Zion, and it's the promise of a forerunner who's going to come and announce that coming of Zion, or of Yahweh to Zion, such that he can now become king and peace can be established. So in those servant songs, you see, well, that's the way chapter 40 begins, and then we have 4 servant songs that come out of that in chapter 42, 49, 50, and then the end of 52 through 53. I think probably most Christians are familiar with Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant.
Right.
That's the last and the longest of the 4 servant songs. But in those servant songs, you see that this entity, this individual, and it's not specifically identified as just one individual, but that's kind of the significance. But Israel is the servant who's been unfaithful. And so Yahweh's going to raise up from within Israel a servant in whom Israel will become Israel indeed, for the sake of it fulfilling its mission on behalf of all the world. Well, the way in which this is going to happen is through Yahweh's return. But his return is specifically in connection with him sending a redeemer whom the Spirit of the Lord will drive. This was the Isaiah 59 context. Again, leading into then, well, yeah, we'll leave it at that because it gets a little bit too much, I suppose. But this Redeemer who is going to come is the one through whom the exiles will be released, the captivity will be ended. All these themes weave together. We talked about how redemption as a key idea is about liberation from exile. It's release from captivity. And so Yahweh's going to come, but as a redeemer, as he had done in Egypt, to do this great delivering, restoring work, connected with this servant that he's going to raise up from within Israel, in whom Israel will be restored. But another key aspect, in addition to redeemer, that is associated with that servant in the servant songs is this role of dealing with uncleanness, a priestly ministration. And certainly Isaiah 53, again, I think many Christians are familiar with that this is the one who will bear the people's uncleanness. He will bear their sickness, their disease. He will bear the stroke that they are due. And in this way, there will be cleansing, there will be renewal, there will be restoration. So once again, we get to this idea that redemption has to be more than just release from physical oppression or captivity or bondage and brought to a new place or a new situation. It ultimately has to be dealing with the relational aspect of exile, which involves this priestly work of atonement, of reconciliation, a redemption that involves release from what really enslaves, which is this principle of the curse and death. And so those ideas are all kind of woven together, certainly in the servant songs in Isaiah's prophecy. But you see them elsewhere, in Hosea's prophecy. Hosea was a contemporary of Isaiah. You see that when God arises and regathers his people back to himself, it's going to actually look like creational renewal. And I think we'll talk more about that as we go on as well. So the prophets, each prophet doesn't deal with all of these things in totality, but when you read them organically and holistically, you see all these themes kind of woven together. But certainly central to that is that this messianic individual is going to be both redeemer and healer of the people, healer of the relationship between God and his people.
As we close too, and you had alluded to it earlier, would love to just kind of maybe put a sharper point on this. Discuss the significance of the prophetic promise of a Davidic priest king, in particular emphasizing both of those roles, particularly Zechariah's merging of kingship and priesthood. And how does this signal a transformed covenant structure fulfilled in rather than abolished by the messianic branch? Speak to that a little bit, because I know we've talked around it a little bit. I'd love to just really make sure we stamp that before we close out today's episode.
And, we can develop it out further moving forward because it is a key theme that I think so many Christians don't really understand. And they certainly don't understand the significance in terms of Christ and this thing of covenant renewal, the new covenant in him. But what we see in the kind of developing scriptural history and progress of Revelation is that there are kind of these two ideas associated with this messianic figure, a priestly dimension and a regal dimension. And we talked about how David, is the great prototype of the Messiah, functions as a priestly king. He's not technically a priest, but he's a priestly king. And you even see some of that in Solomon as well, with the temple episode and the dedicating of the temple. But what happens with Zechariah, specifically in chapter 6, and once again, this is when the exiles have returned, they're rebuilding the temple. In connection with that rebuilding of Yahweh's sanctuary, there is this prophetic disclosure that comes through Zechariah as he's told to make a crown and to put a crown on the high priest, Joshua, and declare this one is the branch, a crowned high priest. And he says, this one will preside as a priest on his throne, and he will build the house of the Lord. And he will do so in connection with people coming from east, west, north, and south, coming from distant places to, in a sense, build into this house under the building oversight or headship of this enthroned priest king. So that's this prophecy that is given through Zechariah. But what's important in that is that if our listeners are aware of the whole Israelite covenant and life and structure in relation to God, that covenant distinguished between the priesthood and the kingship. They were assigned to different tribes. So the Levites, recall again, Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those sons was Levi. The priesthood was bound up within the tribe of Levi. Another one of those sons was Judah. The kingship was bound up in the tribe of Judah. David was of the tribe of Judah. The line of kings of Judah were of that line. And so you couldn't have a king priest in Israel under the Sinai covenant, under the Israelite covenant. They were separated tribally. And so even though, as we said, David functioned in a priestly manner, he wasn't technically a priest. But now what you have is through the prophet Zechariah, the promise that this messianic branch, in him, the kingship and the priesthood are going to be merged together. And that means then by implication that where there is a changing of the priesthood, binding it up in the kingship, and this even associated with David is connected with this Melchizedek figure, who is the kind of the prototypical king priest, right? Psalm 110. We won't go down that path. But even this idea of a king priest begins with David, but again, a priest of a different order. And so the writer of Hebrews brings this out, but it was very obvious even at that time of Zechariah that if there is to be a change in the priesthood, if there is to be such a thing as a king priest presiding over the restored, renewed covenant household, then you have a fundamentally new covenant order as well. This is Hebrews chapter 7. Because the priesthood or the covenant is founded on the priesthood, a change of priesthood means a change of covenant. And we'll talk more about this down the road, but this is where there's so much debate and dispute in terms of new covenant, old covenant. Is it replacement? Is it abrogation? Is it just two administrations of one covenant of grace? How do we understand this old covenant, new covenant thing? And again, we'll talk about it more down the road. But already at that point in Israel's history, 5 centuries before Christ comes, they're confronted with the fact that when God does this renewal, when the branch comes, when the house of Yahweh is really consummated the way he has promised, when this relationship is restored, when there is covenant renewal, it's going to bring in a whole different new order. Even as we talked about, it will make the sons of the kingdom be sons indeed, renewal of heart. This is going to be more than just, a kind of regurgitation of the Israelite theocracy. It's not going to be that. And I think even our millennial theology that is so common in America needs to take this into account, because so many who are waiting for the millennium are effectively waiting for a regurgitation of that kind of Israelite theocracy. And that's not at all what the prophets were promising if we really look at them carefully.
Yeah, and I think a couple key things to stamp as we close, Kit, is just number one, going back to what we said before, it is vitally important for us to not only understand the concept of exile, but obviously, too, is its significance, what it means, ultimately, to even the idea of redefinition and regathering and reconstitution, and how all these things, when they are rightly understood, do manifest themselves throughout salvation history, but maybe not as we initially
Right.
perceive or assume they will too is. And at times when they don't, we often default to just holding on to natural presuppositions and ideas, which at times may be contrary to actually letting scripture speak for itself. We will put a pin in it right there for now as a teaser for next time. We are going to build on this in part 2. We sincerely hope this time that you've shared with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, Farhan, and as always, we'll see you down the road.